Dear God, thank you for the opportunity that we had in the first part to explore a few concepts. I pray and ask that you may be with us now as we go through this second study. Um, I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I had a plan for the second presentation, but I appreciate that I went through a lot of detail in the first part. So I was thinking we could do um, a bit of recap of that first presentation and then discuss a few ideas from that first presentation, and then if we have time, I'll introduce a second topic that I'm trying to build on. So I guess the first thing was, and I'd hope where you're able um, to dialogue with me, um, if you can um, raise your questions or answer questions that I have. Feel free to, as I said, just put your hand up if you have something to say, and then Emma will pick on you. So the first thing is, in your eyes, how do you think we should go about establishing the Sunday law? How do we know? Because there's so many events that happen in the world around us. How do we know when the Sunday law is? What are some of the thoughts that you have in mind? Or what should be the way in which guides us to the answer? And it could be something that I discussed in the first presentation. No one has thoughts? Rogers?
Okay, if I can uh, say something from the first presentation that I understood was that we used time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we use. But I want to add some other thing which I'm thinking about.
So before we
And
get to that other thing, well, let's just stick with time, and then we'll explore that a bit, and then you can go on to your next thing. Why do we use time? What's the purpose of it?
so we use, okay, you explain that the primary way to understand our history is line upon line or compare and contrast.
Okay.
But if I'm moving, for example, from a waymark, let me say the Sunday law,
Mm-hmm.
I then need to understand what past event do I need to go to that I'll compare and contrast with this waymark that I want to understand. What is
Mm-hmm.
going to guide me in on how I choose the past event? It is time.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying you have questions, or we have questions about this waymark as a movement, and we're going to do line upon line to say, okay, what is going to happen here? So I need history one, history two, etc., etc. And so what you've articulated is that how am I going to know which history to go to? And the suggestion is you're going to use time to point you in that direction. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So time is connected to line upon line, and it's connected to connecting histories. It's a bridge. Okay. What was the next point that you wanted to make?
Okay. It may not be so much different from what you have said,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's another way of saying what you have said.
That's
And
okay.
I think I'm going to take this from the studies that were done by Elder Paminda in 2020, Portugal,
Okay.
where he's looking at, I think, 2SM 102,
Mm-hmm.
where he looks at special prophecies and special events. So we have
Yes.
lots of events We have lots of prophecies, but what we are interested in is special prophecies, which then means that we are going to look at special events.
Just looking for that quote. Sorry, I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, as we are looking for it, maybe I'll explain. Like, for example, why do we say 1989 is the time of the end and not 1988 or 1991? It is because 1989, sorry, is a special prophecy, and we have special events happening there. That's why we choose 1989 and not the year before or the year after.
Okay, so I'm just going to post the quote that Rogers has spoken about in the chat. It's 2 SM 102 paragraph 1. So it says, those there are those now living. So we're today. So the period is now. Okay, we're standing here in the present, and we want to understand the prophecies of Daniel and John, the two books of prophecies, um, who received great light from God as they passed over the ground. So, as you are going through an event, that's when you're going to understand the past, you're going to understand the present, which is now, and that's going to give you light that's going to shine to the future. So, just reading that quote in full. There are those now living who, in studying the prophecies of Daniel and John, received great light. So, it's in reading those prophecies that you're going to get this great light as you're passing over the ground. So, as you're going through the events, where special prophecies were in fulfillment in their order. So, as you're walking over the ground, as you're passing through those special prophecies, as Rogers has articulated, not just random events that take place in history, they have to have special properties or special characteristics. And that's what's going to guide you into knowing what's going to happen in the future, looking at the past, specifically in their order. So you're going to have waymarks that take place 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they need to be sequential. They need to build on top of each other. If I can ask Rogers or anyone else, so yes, okay, special events, but how do you know which is the special one? Because in a year, 2019 or 2024 or whatever year it is, there's many things that happen that anyone can point to and say that is special. I think that stands out. And so I guess the discussion in the movement, to a large degree, has been, is it July? Is it November? Is it December? Is it January 2025? January 2025. All those are pretty significant events. But how do you know which one is the special one? Because
Okay.
if you ask anyone in the US, they'll say, "Yeah, no, July was pretty special. That RNC, the election was pretty special. When Trump stood in, signed all those executive orders, that was pretty special." So how do you know which one is the special one?
Okay, maybe to continue with that thought that
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to illustrate is so we have special events and special prophecies.
Yes.
So I'm going to say the special prophecy is the symbol.
Mm-hmm.
The special event is the fulfillment of the symbol.
I like
So
that. Mm-hmm.
in my understanding, what you must first understand is the special prophecy,
Yep.
which then will then guide you to understand the special event. So as an example, we're talking about the way Mark the Sunday law. If I can take Acts 27 is a special prophecy
Mm-hmm.
pointing to that waymark. It gives us characteristics of that waymark. So we understand them, we know them. So it's then our duty in the spirit of rule number 13 of William Miller to look for
Mm-hmm.
the corresponding special historical events that
Mm-hmm.
fulfill those characteristics or symbols.
So I will post the second part of that quote. I purposefully left it out, but it's articulating what Rogers has said. And after we go through this quote, I'll come to you, Philip. Um, so it's the rest of that paragraph. I've posted it in the chat. 2SM 102 paragraph 1 again, and I'll read it. So after what I've just said that Ellen White says about special prophecies, she says historical events. So a historical event is something that that's happened. It's your event, showing the direct fulfillment of prophecy. So that's what Rogers has said, is that here you have prophecy, which has all these different things. And then in your history, as you're passing over certain special events, you're going to have your historical events, historical, that are going to be your fulfillment of these prophecies. So this event is going to fulfill this prophecy. Um, and the prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events leading down to the close of this Earth's history. And so you have these events which are going to lead you somewhere. They're going to take you down to the end of a story. And it's these prophecies that are going to point you in the direction of what that historical event is going to be. Um, the next sentence is the scenes connected with the working of the man of sin are the last features plainly revealed in this earth's history. So we were going to speak about Acts 27 in a bit. And one of the questions that's been on, sorry, 2 seconds. One of the questions that's been on our minds, um, or something that we need to ask ourselves is, what is the sin of the USA? When we consider the story of Acts 27, we recognize that, yeah, in 1863, that ship goes off course, the ship of Alexandria. That ship is the protector or defender of the people. Its job, its function is to protect or defend the people. You get to 1863 and it goes off course. Why? Why did it go off course in 1863? In terms of, now this I'm asking in terms of the SDA application of that ship. What is the thing that we mark as happening in 1863 which leads to a scattering but took this ship off course? So not external USA, but internal the church. Does anyone remember?
Can I speak?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I think if I remember it, 1863, there is the rejection of the foundations, I would say that. And we used to see that by James White coming up with another counterfeit chart, the 1863 chart, that actually omits the most significant doctrines that had founded them and made them a successful movement. So by ending up rejecting the prophetic truth or the foundational truth that they had, the prophetic knowledge they had, you will actually see that this is like taking the ship off course. Because once you deviate from prophecy, you will end up interpreting the word of God in a different.
So I like the way he's framed that and the different answers in the chat, the rejection of time, the rejection of time setting. Um, but one of the questions we need to really get to grips with is why would rejecting the 2520 throw that ship off course? And how it's just been described is that it's prophecy, the 2520, that gives you guidance. It gives you direction in terms of where you are. And Ellen White frames prophecy in this paragraph in selected messages as um, scenes connected with the working of the man of sin as being the last features plainly revealed in this earth's history. So if you want to know what the key features are of the man of sin, or what the issue is of the man of sin, what do you need? You need prophecy, this figurative delineation of events that we've discussed. So, you, as an Adventist, you're living in 2013, and you want to know what the issues are with regards to the man of sin, what the key features are in that story, the Sunday law history in reality. What do you need to guide you? It's prophecy. And so once the SDA Church loses that bearing with regards to the 2520, how do you then go from knowing that something that may be instituted or institutionalized in the Bible is no longer acceptable today? The only thing that can help you do that is the 2520. It's prophecy, because now you're going to recognize that I'm living in the time of the end, 1989. I need to look at the events that are happening around me, understand the context, the world that I'm living in, and then I can see what the issue is today. So often, or at least when Elder Tess first started teaching, a question came into my mind. How should the Millerites have known that Paul tells a slave to go back to their master, and just the master should treat their slave, the enslaved person, well? How were they meant to take that and say, yeah, none of that anymore? Now we're going to actively stand as abolitionists and say, there's no going back to your master. There's no treat your slave well, because that's what's institutionalized in the Old Testament. It's a completely different way of looking at God. It's only coming out of the dark ages, seeing the man of sin in that dark ages, seeing what the sin is, and it's the 2520 that helps you do that. Recognize that now you're living in the time of the end. I can look around me and see that, hold on, that sin that perpetuated through the Catholic Church in the Dark Ages is now being perpetuated in our borders in the USA. And so prophecy gives you that context to know that these are the workings of the man of sin. And so slavery now becomes the issue, the testing issue. And so the same can be said about today. Why this was so significant in taking that ship off course is because you get to 1989 and now you have no bearing with regards to know what the features are of the man of sin: patriarchy, sexism, um, and what the message is, radical feminism, etc. If you don't have that bearing as a church, then you have no way to know what the third angel's message is connected to in your context, in your dispensation. Does that make sense of why this rejection has an impact with regards to the message? It's not just about dates. It's not just about knowing how to calculate 126 from 1863 to 1989. There's a work that it does for you, for us, for the church. Um, so going back to Roger's contribution, and I can't remember who the other person was. I've lost their name. In understanding how we understand where the Sunday law is. What are the tools that we use? I really like this paragraph because
Philip had his hand up, and I think someone else had the hand up.
Yes, I'm going to go back to them.
Okay, no.
It's these tools, and this paragraph articulates it, of how we know what event to look at. It's these prophecies, these histories, that are going to point us to know what the special event is, the special historical event that's going to fulfill that prophecy. So yeah, going back to Philip. I think you were the first one to raise your hand.
Okay, thank you. Your question was, how do you know out of many events that happen, how do
Yes.
you know this particular event is the right one that you can choose? I appreciate the contribution from Rogers, but I'm going to pick from what you said before. You were talking about the principles, like you go to a history and then you pick the principles and you apply the principle, but you don't go from literal to literal. You apply the principle differently based on the time in which you are living in. So what I can say is the application of the principle. For example, when you're using Act 27, you're using Act 27 and it is going to take you to the Pyrrhic Wars. And you are going to see the Pyrrhic Wars where you're going to see you have the War of Ipsas, which is decided by the Hellespont, the Reclia, which is decided by the Hellespont, Club decided by Hellespont, Beneventum decided by the Hellespont, and you see all these things. So, and when you come later to the applications, you realize that the wars is going to come into the second, is going to give you the Second World War, and then you will see how this halopen is being illustrated. You know, there is no halopen there. There are some other modern artilleries, things that are being used that are so modern than the wars that was fought by those of Pyrrhus. So you begin to see how that line up. Also, when you go there, you begin to see the dynamics of war between the rope that is being pulled between different people, like Pyrrhus and Lysimachus and the Cold War, subterfuge, and all these things. And when you come to the real application later, because all these things are going to be applied in our history. For instance, you come to 1989. When you come to 1989, you know the event that happened in 1989. These are the events that started around 1987, and they are going to culminate in 1991 with the dissolutions of the USSR. So how do you come up with the idea of picking 1989 as the main event? So when you see there, you begin to see the marker point is when you go to Pyrrhus history, you see that Cold War that is going to lead to the defeats of the Pyrrhus, and then is going to give over the how do you call Macedonia. So you're now seeing what you see in 1989 is Berlin being divided into two, West and the East is going to be deceived. There's going to be misinformation that is going to be taken to the Eastern side. And, America is going to use economic sanctions and misinformation or subterfuge, how do you call it, disinformations, to draw in or to make these people actually come to the side or to believe in their message. And that is going to lead to the breakdown of the Berlin Wall. And that becomes the main way mark, simply because we are seeing this in the history. We are seeing it in the history. It happened exactly the same way. So we see this could be the exact fulfillment of the prophecy. And the rest become the part of the, how do you call it, when you go, the principle. Because the principle say the history has its beginning and has its ends, and there must be a core point. Yeah.
So just to summarize what Philip has said is that in history you have humans behaving in a certain way. And so you take those events that happened in history and you see, okay, that seems to happen again and again and again within a certain context. So I'm going to take the principle that those events were demonstrating. I'm going to come down to my history and I'm going to say, okay, let me look for an event where that principle is being demonstrated. It's going to look different because the world looks different, but the underlying core principle of what those different histories were demonstrating, I should be able to see in my history. So the point in connecting what Philip has said and the different contributions that came before is that here you have the fulfillment of a principle. I'm going to take that principle and then I'm going to look for the fulfillment of that principle today. And then I think it was Gabriel. You wanted to add or say something different. Was it Gabriel or was it someone else? Okay, if it wasn't Gabriel, there was a different person that wanted to say something.
Yes, Dennis Warami.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Dennis?
I think I wanted also to give a contribution, like how you identify the Sunday law. So I don't know the year, but it's around 2019, 2020, when Elder Tess had a presentation on understanding waymarks. So I think what I remember from the study, there was a confusion based on the waymark 2019. And one of the thoughts I remember was you need to understand the properties of a waymark. So not just the Sunday law actually, but I would just first say for any other waymark. So when you understand a waymark, you need to know that there are two properties, the date and the event. So there is a certain way you need to understand the date. And I think I would buy your argument that the aspect of time is one best catalyst to lead us to understand the date. Because if I remember, one of the tools Elder Tess was able to use in the Mine Cry is prophetic patterns, and actually the same thing you have tried to demonstrate, the time spans. But when you come to the event, and this is also something that I would agree with, most people have also given a contribution. You need to understand that to be able to justify that this is a waymark, you need to be able to separate layers. Some of the times we get confused. We argue along what is this waymark because we are not able also to separate layers. And one demonstration that she was able to give is we were asking ourselves what actually happened on November 9, 2019. And because some were wired to think in the lens of the king of the north and the south, and they can't trace any fulfillment in November 9, they are a bit led to doubt and disbelief in the fulfillment of this waymark. So number two, as much as you want also to pin an event, you need to understand that you need to do it through parable methodology. And I think it's just a recalling of what others have demonstrated. So what was shown is that, number one, you need to be able to thread a story. So you can't just come and say, this is the waymark of the Sunday law, and you are not able to thread a story. And it was seen that you can thread a story within the waymark, just like the waymark 1989. You can see a cause to effect relationship. Before the fall of the Berlin Wall, there is the first breach that is given. You come to 201, after 9/11, we have the first attack on the Afghan soil. So you can thread a storyline within that waymark. You can thread a storyline within a dispensation. We know we have the 4 dispensations in our reform line. So you can take from maybe 1989 to 201, thread a story within. One which was better done was to understanding 2019. We were able to bookend 2014 to 2019, and a story was threaded within that dispensation. So you can take a dispensation like 2021 and the Sunday law and thread within there a story that leads to the waymark Sunday law. Or you can thread a storyline in the entire reform line, because everything begins at the time of the end. So you can be able to thread a storyline. And what you need to see also as you are trying to establish the events, which I'm not going to repeat more, but just re-echo it, is that you need to have stories that have the same properties. And the best one is going to other reform lines. You can go to the history of the 1850, the 1888, which are natural histories or parables that teach us about the waymark Sunday law. So when you pick properties from those histories, you can bring the same properties or principles into this waymark that you want to understand. And then when you are able to have those properties, you can be able now to see the fulfillment. These are the properties that mark the Sunday law from other histories. Do I see anything fulfilled like that? And that's what you're able to do. Not just other reform lines, but even other histories, like you did in the history of Hitler. You can go to that history and bring out a storyline that demonstrates how Hitler is Trump. And if you're able to form your theory without contradiction, I think you'll be able to establish what is the waymark.
Yeah. So, Yeah, and I think this is an important point, which is that you have your date, but I think we can all recognize that just having a date alone means nothing if you don't understand how that fits into the context of the great controversy and the story of redemption. And it's threading that guides you in doing that, and it's understanding the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation and etc etc. But it's being able to dissect that event or that date or that waymark and see that there's two things going on. There's war on the Eastern Front, which is what was just articulated as King of the North versus King of the South. And then there's war on the Western Front, which we would understand is the King of the North going into the glorious land. So that's the King of the North versus the USA. Um, And so you need to take all those different layers, because at a waymark there's multiple things that are going to happen. There's multiple stories, different stories that are going to be told. So you need to be able to isolate the specific story that you're telling and see what the fulfillment is for that specific event. So when we talk about the Sunday law, when we talk about Daniel 11 verse 41, what that primarily is about is the King of the North going into the glorious land. The story of the King of the North versus the King of the South is secondary, because that is an obstacle that the King of the North has to overcome to get into the glorious land. It's like the King of the South is restraining the King of the North from doing this work. But the primary story of that waymark, the Sunday law, when we speak about it in that context, is this. So you need to know what the fulfillment is for that. So the example that was given was November 9. What happened on November 9? And in other studies, you can demonstrate how, again, that's a story of the Republican Party and their consolidation around Trumpism that leads you to the Sunday law. What I want to reiterate about threading is I'm living here in, here's the Sunday law that I'm trying to understand. It's 2020, or let's make it a bit more real. If today is the 29th of March, 29 March 2025, and I have all these different events that take place in my history. So threading plays a part in our methodical toolbox. But what was one of the dangers that I articulated in the first presentation, if anyone can remember? It's not that this is wrong to do threading, it's what are the dangers of using threading? Why do you need to be cautious when you're threading? Think about it. You're living in March 2025, and you want to understand the Sunday law. What do you need to be careful of when you're threading? Rogers, you have your hand up.
If I'm not wrong, I think you said it is subjective.
What does that mean? How is it subjective?
Maybe a story that I will pick will be different from a story that the other person will pick.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Sandra articulated it in the chat as you need to be consistent. But how do you ensure that consistency? So this threading, it needs to be consistency. This threading needs to be consistent. But how do you know you're being consistent? Because Rogers can stand up and do a presentation and tell a story that connects 1989 through all our different waymarks, 2001, 2014, 19. But Rogers is going to tell a story from a specific perspective that's going to give him the conclusion that he wants over here. So he's going to thread and go through all that, but Rogers already has a conclusion in mind, and so Rogers is going to say, okay, then this event that happened on this day, that must be the culmination of that story. Each of us can tell a different story. So how do you know which one is the story? And so me saying all this is not to discount threading or progression or etc. It's just one of the things that us as students of Bible prophecy need to be mindful of, is that it's open to interpretation. So what gives you the firm, true, like this is what it is? There's no subjectivity about it. This is what it is. And my suggestion was, and I think other people have articulated it this way, is that it's this repeat of history. You have your properties of your waymark, that you read Great Controversy, you read Desire of Ages, you read Ellen White's books, you read Daniel Revelation, and you build up a list of properties that you expect at the Sunday law. Then you look into history for those different properties or principles as it was articulated. And then you do your line upon line, you get to your history and you say, okay, nice, I can see this event has fulfilled those principles or those properties. So now I'm going to thread to see what it looks like in my history, as was said about elephants and dictators and etc. Um, Dennis, I think you had wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think you just answered. I thought like you were asking like, what should we know that uh, when we are trading a story, that we are not being subjective. And I think you are saying that the properties of the Wema called what Rogers called the special prophecy, the symbols are the ones that should lead us.
Guide
So
you.
like you ought to have a model that leads you. I remember sometimes back we used to have an exercise through Elder Paminda, like when someone asks you a question, instead of just directly answering, the question was, what is your story? Like you need to be able to understand the story first before you give an answer. So that idea brings me like, if at all we are speaking about the Sunday law, we first need to outline the properties of the Sunday law, as Daniel 11:41 outlines. It's an issue about America conquering of the glorious land. And I think that's like an anchor point. And then you can be able to draw your narratives within the symbologies that are given.
Yeah. Sorry, I know lots of people have written things in the chat. It's very difficult for me to follow what the chat is. So if you can, please raise your hand and say what you need to say. But I can read short messages, but it's a bit more difficult for me to read long messages. Nick?
Okay. All right. You see,
Sorry,
in order
Philip,
to
Nick,
trade,
can Nick speak? Because Nick hasn't spoken yet, if that's okay.
sound like
Okay, thank you. One of the things that I was considering also is the issue of the turning point. Once a specific point is marked in prophecy and something, it has a property that shows, even though we can tread like from this point to this point, this is the story, you can see a sharp something sharp and short and specific, which appears to be like, this is the point now, and this is future, and yesterday was the past. So
Okay.
this is a point that we are marking as sharp, and I think prophecy informs history, and I think also history informs prophecy, because we usually say like we are observers of prophecy, and we are the ones also creating prophecy. So therefore, using the same example that you referenced in Solomon, why prophecy has confidence in predicting the future is because it understands that human nature doesn't change. So, in specific conditions or whatever, this is how human beings will behave. I think human behaving is likened to creating prophecy. And as well, the historical, the newspaper prophets, the historians outside, when most of these prophecies, when we mark like 1989 or any point, we realize that the historians as well will have a way of explaining without pointing to the Bible or whatever that shows that that point is indeed a point to focus on in a certain issue, which happens to be the same issue as students of prophecy point to. So we have that in agreement as well from outside and us inside.
Yes. Thank you. Philip?
Okay, others have said much of it, and when I looked, in order to track the history, you know, a long time ago, before the midnight cry message, we used to have the message. We used to have different type of message, like we say at the midnight cry. There's the message of Islam. There's, you know, things were actually condensed and they were actually being taught at the same time. But after the midnight cry, it became very clear that when you are approaching the message of Islam, you have to start the message of Islam from the very beginning to the end. That is, you have to straight that from the beginning, from where you are pulling the story from. For example, when you are going to history, the rise of Islam and how throughout the ages, how it behaves, and when you apply it, so you still go through the same thread. And so when you're talking about also Sunday law, we are going through the same threads. And I don't think we are going to use the principle. And that's what I'm going to repeat again. The idea is, what principle do you really pick from there? Because what would make you different is the principle that you pick from the history, and then you come and apply it. For example, I'm bringing the example here. Elder Terry is going to pick the principle, the idea of voting, which he actually got from the Elder Tess, the idea of voting, and she applied exactly to the Sunday law, because the Sunday law had been already established as that waymark, and the name that had been used to establish the Sunday law is the same name where the voting is coming from. So you are going to see this is going to be picked from the history, and it's going to differ from the what Ellen White used, which is the law. You're going to see how the principle passed, the principle of law ended somewhere. And by principle, okay, the application of, let me say, is like a policy of law is going to end somewhere, but the principles is going to shift into voting. I think that's what I want to say
Okay.
in that context.
Thank you. One thing that I want to pick out from that was that often it can be assumed that our study of prophecy of the Bible is not grounded in Ellen White's writings anymore. It's just politics. It's just world affairs. But I'd argue that that's where we go wrong when we just think that prophecy is reading the Washington Post or the New York Times, or the term has been given newspaper prophet. What that should do is help you understand what Ellen White is talking about in your context. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of people don't read Ellen White's writings as much as they did once upon a time. But if you go over and read The Great Controversy again, specifically those last chapters dealing with the Sunday law history, and you understand what it is the Sunday law is really about, you start to pick out that it's this contention or this idea of democracy, and how that's what makes the sixth kingdom unique. So when the seventh kingdom comes, the dragon, it's going to be an issue regarding democracy and what it is that holds democracy stable, keeps democracy afloat. So when Ellen White talks about republicanism, I sent you, I sent Elder Emma a list of quotes by Ellen White. We just didn't end up going through that study, but it's just a list of quotes where Ellen White is talking about the principles of the sixth kingdom and what makes the sixth kingdom a lamb. And in simple words, it's this idea of republicanism and Protestantism. That's what makes the sixth kingdom the sixth kingdom, its principles. So if you want to understand, okay, what's the seventh kingdom? You have to compare and contrast it to that. So this whole story is about democracy. When it talks about a law being passed in the United States in 1888 with the Blair Bill, or years later in understanding that war with Spain that we spoke about, it's all within the context of what is the appropriate way for a democratic country to behave? What makes the US great, or the glorious land? What made it special? And I think Ellen White describes these two, civic and Protestant principles, as being the bedrock of the USA's power and prosperity in the context of an asylum for people. So one of the things that we should be anchored in and understanding as a marker for the Sunday law is this story of democracy. Now, what I have suggested is, and what everyone has suggested is okay, we have this principle in the change of kingdoms, or the transition point between sixth and seventh. When I say transition point, there's different ways in which we can understand that transition point. If you go to ancient Israel, we know that in 4 BC, there's a transition between here the Christian church begins with the birth of Christ, and it's not until 34 AD. Oh no, sorry. It's not until 34 AD that you have the Christian church fully established. Now it's going to go and do a work. At that same point, you have the Jewish church. Well, I'll say it in this way: probation closes for the Jewish church. Their chance to be God's people or God's vehicle for the Gentiles comes to an end. And this is when the Christian church becomes that vehicle now. So you can mark the birth of the Christian church here, as we do, and its work beginning here, and the Jewish church, its death or its end as taking place in 4 BC. Ellen White gives the commentary of the angels flying over Jerusalem, giving a message and having a message, but the leadership just were not there to accept it, and so they have to go somewhere else, and they end up going to the wise men, etc., etc. So there's two significant points in that story. It's here at the beginning of that reform line, and then it's at 34 AD. So that's talking about God's church. Now, we can compare and contrast that to understand the sixth and the seventh kingdom as well. Because at one level, you could put the Jewish church here, the Jewish economy, or I'm just going to call it Jewish church, and the Christian church here, as this transition point between the two. So the time of the end being that marker. But there's this overlap that takes place as well, which is the lead down to that final death, if you want to call it that, of the Jewish church, and the overlap that leads you to the accomplishment, or the final creation of the Christian church. And so we have the same thing with the sixth and the seventh kingdom, is that here at the time of the end, 1989, you have the sixth kingdom and the seventh, a new kingdom starting, that can be marked here. But from another perspective, as we line up 34 AD with the Sunday law, it's the fall of one and the rise of another that bring you here. So now you have the seventh kingdom and you have the sixth. And then in another story, you could mark this transition from Panium, all depending on the story. I think Elder Parminder has explained or articulated that a few weeks ago in Tahiti, if I'm not mistaken. But the point that I want to take from that is that this marker, this Sunday law marker, is the point in which you go from 6th to 7th. So if you want to know what the marker is, the Sunday law is, you need to understand what this sixth kingdom is about. What makes this sixth kingdom the sixth kingdom? And you can compare and contrast that with the seventh kingdom and what makes the seventh kingdom the seventh kingdom. And Ellen White is going to tell you that what makes the sixth kingdom is its principles, republicanism and Protestantism. But more so, she describes the Declaration of Independence, and that's what you find in your quotes, as being the embodiment of this asylum type nation. It's reading from the Declaration of Independence itself. I just want to read one of the quotes. Okay, I can't find it. But the point is that in the Declaration of Independence, you have this breakaway from the monarchy rule in Britain. And the point that Thomas Jefferson is making in that is that all humans are equal. There's no one person that's more equal than the other. Counterintuitive statement, but there's no one person that sits above the law where others are subject to the law. It's that all humans are subject to the law. And all humans have the right to pursue life, or have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's the principle that everyone's been discussing. It's understanding what the principle is of this nation. Equality under the law. That's the principle of the sixth kingdom. Now, how do you enforce those principles? How do you maintain those principles and ensure that they are going to be fulfilled or demonstrated or articulated and etc.? For ancient Israel, it was the Ten Commandments. It was the Jewish economy, the Mosaic law, the sanctuary, the ceremonies. All those are what we would call as institutions that help to articulate or demonstrate or protect those principles of love your neighbor, love yourself. So you have, I'm just going to call it life, liberty, happiness as the principle that makes the sixth kingdom the sixth kingdom. And you need something to enforce that principle. So for ancient Israel, the principle was love God, love your neighbor. The mechanism to protect that were institutions. The institution of the Ten Commandments, the institution of the Sabbath, the institution of the sanctuary, the Mosaic law, all those different institutions. And so in the context of the USA, that institution was the Constitution. The Constitution is made up of various institutions, the separation of powers, the equality under the law, enforcing equality under the law, etc., etc. So this is the sixth kingdom. If that's what makes the sixth kingdom the sixth kingdom, just reading through those quotes that you have that were sent around, hopefully, and we want to understand, okay, so if this is the point, the Sunday law is the point where the seventh kingdom, aka the king of the north, marches into the glorious land, then it has to be about this. It has to be understood in this context, which is put in a simple package, democracy. So now I want to understand, okay, what are the special prophecies that point to special events in my time about democracy? And when you go into history and you understand the breakdown of democracies, there's two ways in which democracy can break. It's either with a coup, with tanks rolling in on the street and going to storm and take power away from the president or the chancellor or whatever. Or you can have what was done with Hitler and Caesar, working in the system. So doing it in a legal way. And so when we look to the USA today, and this is where threading comes into the story, is how do we expect democracy to be undermined in the 21st century in the United States? Is it through illegal activities, so tanks storming down to overturn elections, to remove the sitting president? Trump tried that. Trump tried that 2021, and it didn't work because those institutions are too strong. So the alternative is Hitler, how Hitler did it. That's our special prophecy that's going to point us in the direction of the special fulfillment of that event. And so we discussed in our first presentation how the rise of Hitler, I think, is an incredibly apt parallel with what we should see as the rise of Trump. First, Hitler tries this revolution, this revolt, and he fails, and he realizes that I'm not going to achieve power this way. Writes Mein Kampf, creates his platform, garners support, and the marker for Hitler coming to power, or what we would say is the seventh kingdom coming to power, in that story about Hitler and democracy, was that conservatives fail. They fail at keeping the populist at bay. And so that's history one. That's your prophecy as it was articulated in selected messages. The other prophecy that we can point to is Caesar. We know that in 538, or in 533 to be more specific, the Pope is made the head of all churches. 538, that becomes enforced when the Ostrogoths are removed. So where in history do I see a similar dynamic? And we get to 63 BC, where Julius Caesar is going to run for the position of Pontifex Maximus, the head of all churches, the person that's going to be put in charge to lead the culture of society. Remember, religion and culture go hand in hand. So here's my story number two, my prophecy number two. So I'm going to take these different elements and say, okay, fine. Now I want to understand the Sunday law today in the topic of democracy. What's going to be the mechanism that brings me to the seventh kingdom, to the king of the north going into the glorious land? And these are just two examples. You can find many more lines in which the point that I'm trying to articulate is demonstrated. That it's conservatives in our story, Republicans that fail as gatekeepers to keep these populists out. Hitler, Caesar, in Europe you can point to others, and etc., etc. And the point in which we recognize that shift or that driver as taking place, the culmination of that work of the Republicans selling out, if you want to call that, was July. Because in July, the Republican Party determines that Trump is going to be the person that leads us in this war against the glorious land. They fully buy into this ideology, Trumpism. So I know a lot of people have spoken about voting in the chat, but I'd want to suggest that when we think about democracy and everything that democracy entails, voting is just a very small component of what makes a democracy a democracy. And how do I know that? Because there are several non-democratic nations that vote, and yet they are still autocratic. Hungary is the simplest one to see, and various more. Alpaminda shared an article in the broadcast group a few weeks back about America becoming a competitive autocracy or something along those lines. And the point of that article was to demonstrate that elections still take place. And in the context of the USA, probably free and fair elections. But because the population has, at least in 2024, bought into Trumpism, they will vote for that person to go in. So voting can't be the thing that marks the breakdown of democracy. If anything, 2024 showed that voting was still intact and it was people wanting Trump to fix their problems. So democracy has to have another marker as being the thing that means that it shifts or it backslides. The term is called democratic backsliding. So I know Elder Terry has spoken about voting in the context of her studies. When she does, if you would ask her what that is really about, I'd suggest it's not really about voting. It's a story about democracy. And so when we go into history, it's not that we're looking for stories about voting, it's we're looking for stories about democratic backsliding. So to wrap up, and then we'll do a more formal question and answer, is what I wanted to try and go through in this part was if we're going to establish the Sunday law and we're going to understand what it is the Sunday law is, because there'll be various suggestions of what the Sunday law is. At least my opinion is that the thing that should guide us is one, time. That's going to point us in the right direction, to anchor us, because without time, you end up scattered. You end up shipwrecked, if I can put it that way. You end up not knowing where to look. And so the 2520 in prophecy helps you understand the man of sin better, and the features of the man of sin. And then the second thing is what various people have suggested, is it's line upon line. It's parable teaching. It's going from one history to another. Once you understand what your waymark is about, what the principles are, and you get all of that information from Ellen White, Daniel, Revelation, you can take those principles, look in history, and see, okay, I see there's this repeating pattern. I think someone in the chat had written about a repeating pattern. You see a repeating pattern, and you recognize that, okay, in this repeating pattern, these things tend to happen again and again and again. So when I see the fulfillment of that event in my history, I should be able to say, that's the fulfillment of this principle, as you try to orient yourself. And so a lot of people tend to ask me, Curtis, what are you saying? And the conclusion of all of that is the year of the Sunday law, I'm suggesting, is 2024. The month and day of the Sunday law is July, we'll say 18. And the reason why is not because it's just numbers that point to that. I think that's one part of the process, is what does time help you point to? But it's the story, as has been articulated, that you're telling about this waymark, as it's being guided by history, as it's being guided by line upon line. So I appreciate that you could demonstrate that this is the fulfillment or the culmination of a work that began in it really began in 1989, but people often point to 2014 as the purging of the Republican Party. And so then in 2019, you see that happening again with Trump's impeachment. In 2021, you see that happening again with the Republicans backing Trump in that second impeachment. So I appreciate that there's this thread that you can tell, or the story that you can tell with regards to the overthrow of the Republican Party. And I'm not here to argue against that. I think that that's valid. I think that that is true. And I think that that's one of the ways in which you could establish that this is the Sunday law. My only suggestion is that this alone, as students of prophecy, which we are, I don't think should be the primary vehicle in which we understand this waymark. Because someone else is going to stand up and going to talk about all these years, 2014, 19, 21, 20, yeah, all these different years with a different story, which are valid. So this event that they're going to tell in their story did happen in that year. They're going to tell another story that happened in 2019 and another in 2021. And they're going to show how the fulfillment of this story points to a different date. And so at least my hesitancy in using this to establish the Sunday law is that what happens when someone else tells a very convincing different story is, and they arrive at a different conclusion. How are you going to know which one to pick between this story or this story? And so that's if you were to ask me, Curtis, what is what you are teaching? What are you presenting? It's the role that the Republicans should have played in keeping Trump out, and that being demonstrated by the rise of Hitler, by the rise of Julius Caesar into power. I just spoke about two, but Mussolini was the same thing. And it can be demonstrated over and over again that conservatives play a particular role in history in protecting democracy. Um, and so that transition from 6 to 7, that's the marker, is seeing what makes that transition take place. So I didn't speak about the failure of the Sixth Kingdom or the Glorious Land and etc. I think that's a separate study, which we were going to go into today, but we ended up doing something different. So I hope that made sense, and we can do a bit of a Q&A. Let me hear your thoughts. If you have alternative perspectives, yeah, this is the opportunity to do that. So I don't know, Alda Emma, do you want to end this recording and then start a Q&A, or just go straight into a Q&A?
I guess we've been going around 10. We could just go straight into Q&A, so it'll save time.
Okay.
Because I know we're short of time if people don't mind.
Okay. So as I think we started this initiative in the first week of February, and I've taught many things since then, and I know that one of the requests for me has been, can you repeat a lot of what you're doing? Just my personality means that I struggle to do that because my attention is short, and so I constantly want to do different stuff. And so my point in saying all that is, if you have questions about things that I've taught in the past, then feel free to ask about those things. One of the things, just as a reminder, one of the things that I've tried to establish is between Panium and the Sunday law, we have 273. So I've tried to give arguments as to why this story is about the king of the north, Egypt, sending ambassadors to Rome, who is the king of the north. Egypt as a symbol of the dragon. I've tried to make the case that this was the overturning of Roe v. Wade, or what was the name of the court case? I've hit a blank.
Dobbs.
Dobbs. Thank you. Thank you very much, Snyder. Dobbs, versus Jackson, v. Jackson. and that was the fulfillment of 273. My argument in that, to say briefly, is Egypt. What did they want in this history after um, the king of the north and the king of the south at Beneventum? Egypt didn't care about the king of the south. They were interested in forming this alliance with Rome for a different reason.
Sorry, Patrick, I wanted to ask.
Sorry, can I finish? Hello? I can't hear you too well.
I didn't get how you put Dobby versus Jackson in 273.
Okay, yeah, so I'll explain that. So I guess I'll take that as the first question. Could you mute? So I was just trying to lay down the different things that I've taught in the past, not without an explanation, but I'll explain that in a bit more detail now. So question 1 is, why do I put Dobbs here in 273 in 2022? And so let's explore that history. This was the Battle of Beneventum. That led up to 272, and you have 275, 275, 274. Someone correct me. When was the Battle of Beneventum? 275. Great. So you have the King of the North fighting against the King of the South at the Battle of Beneventum. The King of the North wins, which was Rome. And in 273, Egypt is going to send ambassadors to Rome. Who was Egypt in this story? What was the purpose why did Egypt send ambassadors to Rome? I'm just going to answer it now for lack of time. Egypt saw that Rome was a rising power. They've just defeated Pyrrhus in 275 in the Battle of Beneventum. And so Egypt is at war with Seleucus and all the other various nations around them. And so they need an ally to fight that war. So Egypt needs an ally to fight a separate war, separate to the king of the south. So Egypt is not sending ambassadors to Rome to fight against Pyrrhus. That's the first important consideration. Egypt not fighting Pyrrhus, the king of the south. They wanted an alliance with Rome to fight their wars, and they saw that Rome would be a good partner in that fight, in that battle. So when Aldateus first taught this, she put the papacy here as the king of the north, and she put Egypt here as the UN. So those were her first studies in 2018. But if you investigate Aldateus's growth in her message over time and what we've understood as who these symbols represent, the papacy is not the king of the north. The papacy is the USA. The king of the north is the USA. A specific element of the USA, Trump's USA, if I can call it that, Trumpism. The UN is not, sorry Lydia, I'll get back to you. The UN is not the seventh kingdom of Bible prophecy. It's not the kingdom that wants to rule the world. In the Time of the End magazine, that's where we would mark the UN as that kingdom. But as Aldateus demonstrated, and I guess as we have a movement have come to recognize, that UN does not and cannot fit that symbol of the seventh kingdom. So what has helped me in my mind understand who the application of these symbols are is the seventh kingdom is the dragon, right? And so if you read Ellen White's writing, she's going to say the threefold union is comprised of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And then in a different place, she's going to point to what the ideology of those are. The dragon is symbolized by spiritualism. Spiritualism. The king of the north, apostate Protestantism. In the Vesper studies that Elder Tess did, she expressed spiritualism in different ways. Spiritualism as atheism, but one of the very interesting ways in which she expressed it as was libertarianism. And so what libertarianism is, very briefly, is basically decentralized governments. It's freedom, it's liberty, it's everything that the various institutions of the USA are built on. Specifically, the Supreme Court at the moment is guided by this libertarian ideology. So when Clarence Thomas and the various other conservative justices decide to overturn Roe v. Wade, if you read through their arguments and understand their ideology, they're not doing it from a perspective of abortion should be illegal, abortion should not be done, and etc. I don't know what their personal views are, but their argument is grounded on a libertarian argument that the states should decide the matter for themselves. Because when the USA was being founded, their fear was we're just going to create another king. And so that's the argument of states' rights. It's that the states should have rights to decide, or should have the right to decide things for themselves without the federal government telling them what to do. If it's not written in the Constitution, then the states should decide it for themselves. And so Clarence Thomas is going to make that argument that the states should decide abortion for themselves. He's not saying abortion should be illegal or abortion should not happen. He's just saying let the states decide. Again, I don't know what his personal convictions are about the issue. In fact, I don't even care. What I care about is what argument is he making to overturn Roe v. Wade? What argument are those justices making? And it's this libertarian argument. So I'm suggesting that the dragon is guided by libertarianism. And that's what 1776 is about. It's a libertarian movement to declare independence from the USA. And so the various institutions in the Constitution in the USA, whether it's the Electoral College or the current thinking of the conservative Supreme Court justices, it's all built on libertarian thinking. So when they overturn Roe v. Wade, they do so because and in doing so, the king of the north, which is apostate Protestantism, another way of saying apostate Protestantism is a culture that has gone back to the culture that was demonstrated in the Dark Ages under the fifth beast. And that's what Trumpism is. So, Trumpism. We know that Trumpism has benefited by the culture war surrounding the abortion question in garnering evangelical voters and garnering support from his base, etc. The point is that this issue has been politicized by Trump, by the Republican Party. So when the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, they create an alliance with Trumpism. That's going to lead to this entity going to make war in their various battles onwards. So someone who had asked that question, why I say this is the fulfillment of 273. That's a very brief overview of why I suggest so, and why I suggest that Egypt is not fighting the king of the south. Because in history, Egypt were not fighting the king of the south. So whoever you're going to make Egypt today, it can't be in the context of them wanting to fight the king of the south. It's specifically with regards to what Egypt wants and how it benefits the king of the north. Leonard, you have your hand up?
Thank you. Now, in your study, you have shown the 10 years from 2014 to 2024. And 2014 was a Sunday law. And what marked the Sunday law in 2014 was a process, not a point. Do we expect the same in 2024, that the Sunday law in 2024 is a process and not a point?
So just to clarify, that's separate to this. Can I just ask if this question was answered, and then I'll get to your question? Does anyone else have any other questions about this 273? And then I'll get to Leonard's question. Okay, no. Okay, so if I understood the question correctly, it's 2014, we mark, I don't know, 30 things happening in 2014. So 2024, 2014 was no one date given. So should we expect the same thing today? Now, let me not use 2014 as my example. Let me use all the other waymarks. 1989, 2001, skipping 2014, 2019, 2021. I think it was Rogers at the beginning who pointed out, which I agree with, that when you're approaching a waymark, there are different stories, and you need to be able to separate those stories when thinking about what exactly you're talking about. So in 1989, the date that we would associate with that waymark, which LTS has associated with that waymark, is November 9, as well as I think it's September 11. But I want to stick with November 9 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. 2001, 9/11. 2019, November 9. 2021, she didn't say it explicitly, Aldertess, but you can pretty much bring it out that January 6 was the marker for that on the Western Front. So all these different waymarks have dates associated with them, specific points in time associated with them. You can go on and on, 2018, 2020, each of the various waymarks. So why would it be different for 2014? I know Aldertes points to 30 things that happen in that year. That's us distinguishing in our minds that a year is significant, but now when you zoom in on a specific story, there's a date that is associated with that story. She never went into the specific dates that we attach to the various stories that take place. The various stories that take place there are the East Wind. There is a specific date that you can associate with the East Wind. There is the Western Front. There's the Eastern Front, etc., etc. There's multiple stories that she ties to that. For each of those stories, I'm suggesting that you could find a specific date for them. For whatever reason, she didn't do that. But on this, because this is a Sunday law, there is a date. Just like every other waymark that we have, there is a point in time that marks 2014 as the Sunday law. Someone would have to go back into that year and prove why that day fulfills that characteristic. But every time this question has been brought up, I've asked in my head, at least for me, why would 2014 be any different from 1989, 2001, 2019, 2018, 2020, 2021, that each have specific points in time that are unique, are special to highlight something significant happening. So I appreciate that typically we don't put a point in time for 2014, but I'm saying we should, and we should have. We just haven't done it. And so, yes, to more broadly answer your question, I think there is a concept of a period of time in the year, but I think that is more so because there's multiple stories going on, and you need to be able to separate them. I think there's a point that points to the story on the Western Front that encapsulates the essence of the King of the North going in and the going into the glorious land. What I didn't speak about today is what Aldates has demonstrated in that story about the nature of waymarks. I think it was that presentation about the nature of waymarks, is that in a specific waymark itself, in the story of, let's just say, the glorious land, there is, so let's put 1989 as an example. And maybe this is what you were asking about a period, but in 1989, we have the Berlin Wall fall on November 9. But in the lead up to that was, I'm forgetting the history too clearly, but there were picnics that happened on the border of East and West Germany that ended up just becoming protests that led to November 9. So there's a start and an end point to this waymark in the context of the King of the North and the King of the South. You can go internally and find two different dates. So the point is that there's a bookend of time, a start and an end to that. And you can show the same thing with 9/11, that you have 9/11 and then you have September 11 and then a different date. That's the start and the end point. So in 2024, I think that bookend is July and December, and I won't explain why now. December 17 being the electoral college, because it's an institution doing that work, and July 18 being the point of that. You can watch some of my other presentations as to why I say that. But all I'm getting at that is that 2014, I think, is when we say a point in a period, what do we mean exactly? I think there is a significant point, which I'm making the case was July 18. The period is about that and wherever that end is going to be. So my point in saying that is I don't think it's sufficient to just say 2024 as a whole is the marker of the Sunday law, because 2014 as a whole historically was used as the marker for the Sunday law. I think in 2024 you're going to find multiple stories. So if you want to tell the story about the King of the North and the King of the South, then you're probably not going to find that July 18 and whatever date you have as the end year are going to be that end of that period. You're going to find other dates. But yeah, I does that kind of answer your question? I may have gone off on a tangent and not even answered your question, but that's how I see it, at least. Hello? Okay. If that's okay. I think Rogers, you had your hand up first. I'll go Rogers, Nick, Dennis, and then Willie, if Willie wants to ask something.
Yes.
Okay.
in you answering Leonard's question, there is something you have written that I want to question on.
Okay.
So you've written that if you can scroll the way marks you drew, I think you've written that Penium, she marks it at January 6th, 2021. I don't know why that is. Yeah, this one here. But my question is, how is that so? Because the formalization in that history is August 15th, 2021.
So what we should be able to do in our minds is distinguish between the lines that we're talking about. We have the line of the 144,000 and then we have the line of the priests. 2, 3, 4, 5, 1989, 2001, 2014, 2019, and 2021. And then this is, yeah, Raphia, Panium. Okay, so this question comes up a lot, and how I understand it is when you're understanding a line, you have to look at that line on its own. So if we're going to study the line of the priests, the line of the 144,000 becomes, it's not your study. Your study is the line of the priests. And in the line of the priests, you have 2021, August 21, if I remember correctly, when the USA pulls ambassadors out of Afghanistan as Exeter, or how you called it, the formalization in this history between 2019 and 2021. And so the question is, how do you have this year? So I'll take this back to our top. How do you have August 21 here and January 6 here when August happens after January 6th? Does everyone see the problem? And the answer to that problem is, like with what we spoke about in different stories, like we understand about waymarks and multiple things going on, William Miller's rule says every word needs to have its proper bearing, and what gives it bearing, every word or waymark, is the story that you're telling, the prophecy that you're explaining. So in the story of the priests, this is the formalization, August 21. But this means nothing on this line, in this prophecy, in this story, on the line of the 144,000. On the line of the 144,000, what you have is, this is your increase of knowledge, and this is your formalization. And August 21 is nothing. Here's your Boston, here's your Concord, here's your Exeter. There is no August 21 on the line of the 144,000. Or at least there is no this small waymark here. And so now, in this story, that's what's going to be war on the Western Front, as the suggestion is made. Does that make sense, Rogers?
No, I don't think so. Because maybe you don't answer my question. Because if in the lower line, we have August 15th. I don't know why you said August 21. August 21.
August 15. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So August 15th is the formalization. Then 2021, there will be Penium in this line of the priests. And that will be after August.
And so what's your... So I understand that this is Panium from the line of the priests, right? And so the question is, when does this happen on the line of the priests?
Yes.
So we need to find what this is on the line of the priests. This, I'm suggesting, is the line of the 144,000. It's not about the priests. It's about the 144,000. So this second advent would be different. You'd find a different date. Yes, August. I don't know what date you're going to have for that. December or whatever. I haven't explored it. My point is that these are different stories. This is a second advent on the line of the priests, and this is a formalization on the line of the 144,000. So they're different events.
Okay. Maybe I'll ask and maybe I'll leave it there because I don't want us to have a back and forth. You're saying it's a different event, but the symbol is the same because this is Penium and that is Penium as well. If that be the case, why is it that then 2001 in the line of the 144,000 is the same event we are marking in the line of the priests, and the same to 1989 is the same event that we are marking? Why is that becoming different here? Because the symbol is the same. It is Penium, Penium. So does that mean the symbol now has different meanings for different lines?
The symbol has different... I think that's what it is, though, because the symbol is going to mean different things for different groups of people. And what we do with that is there's overlap between 2014, 2016. So on the line of the Nethinims, wherever that ends, this is going to be a plowing, and this is going to be a lateran for the priests. So this history or this event is going to mean different things for different people. The marker is going to have different translations. They're going to, yeah. So I didn't fully understand your point about the symbol having different meanings.
What I understand is to say the event is the same, but the event means different things for different people.
And I'm suggesting that it doesn't have to be the same. Or not, I'm suggesting, LTS was suggesting that the event doesn't have to be the same. They have to align in terms of the year. That's the important thing. But just like the King of the North and the King of the South will have one event, because that's a story about the King of the North and the King of the South, the King of the North going into the glorious land is going to have a different date. So that's the thing. It's that they're different stories. So now this story is going to be about the plowing of the Nethinims. And here, okay, sure, they do align, but that's the story. So this story is going to be different from this story, just like how the King of the North versus the King of the South is a different story to the King of the North in the glorious land. And you can have different dates with those. And sometimes they overlap. So an example of that would be, I think 2016 is a good example of the overlap between the King of the North in the glorious land and the King of the North and the King of the South and their relationship, is that there is an overlap in those stories, but in other places it's different. Okay. Schneider? Okay. Oh, sorry. I can't remember the order that the hands were in. So, yeah. Willie? I think you had your hand raised.
Yeah. I want to reference how you used the 2520 in your first study. So you did demonstrate that the 2520 can come in the guise of the 1260 in the morning. And then in that light, then January 6th, 2021 was the departure point for the 1260. I did not quite understand why that took you from January 6th, 2021 to July 18th, 2024. I'd thought that could take you to July 6th, 2024, if January 6th, 2021 is your departure point. So I just needed clarification why the departure point, or sorry, why the end point is July 18th, 2024, as opposed to uh, July 6th, 2024.
So I'm going to reference studies that Elder Parminder did in 2012. In 2012, in trying to demonstrate this same principle, was that he is going from, because remember it's months, years and month, so it's 3 years 6 months. And so Elder Parminder demonstrates that from September 2001 you have 3 years 6 months that bring you to March, I think it's March 2005. And so the point or the principle being demonstrated there is that it's years and months that are connected, not necessarily days. So if you want something to understand the day, you'd use a different thing to guide you. It's like with the 2520 itself as 2,520 years. I don't know the specific day that Assyria went in and took the king captive, Manasseh captive, but we can point with pretty good accuracy as to the year in which it took place. And so it goes with your 2520, and it's going to bring you to the year 1844 from 677. In the similar breath, what we're pointing to when we say this 3 years, 6 months is the month in which September took place, 9/11, 2001, and the year that it took place, to bring you to 3 years, 6 months to March 2005. For reference, this was when the 2520 was revealed or understood in as a movement, where it was discovered again. And then again, 3 years, 6 months, Elder Parminder demonstrates that that brings you to September 2008, where you have the Lehman Brothers, the economic crash in the USA. And so to answer your question, it's not necessarily the bringing to the date. I can't remember what the date was here, but because it's 3 years, 6 months, the anchor is the year and the month, the number of years and months. And so you go from the year, you calculate your years, and you calculate your months. That's what's bridging you. And so that's why I suggest it's not necessarily 6 to 6. It's a story of year and month to year and month.
Just a follow up, that I think what you are demonstrating in regards to that principle makes sense, but I'm just thinking about how Elder Tess is laying her studies when she is speaking to 11:9. Isn't like she's specifically tracing 11:9, and she's moving specifically from 111.9, and the end point will leave her at the same date she started on. And this, I think, this partly what you are referencing when you are answering Leonard's studies on how we name waymarks. I understand that when we are moving, for example, if we are not telling the story of Islam, then we just reference 2001. So then, if you have a prophetic period, it will leave you the end point, it will just leave you in a year, not necessarily a date. But when you are referencing a date, then I think your endpoint should be the same as your sorry, your endpoint should be the same as your departure I've always thought that is the pre, at least from Eldate's studies.
So if you go back and you find how she uses November 9, and etc., there's some instances where she connects them by the year. So I don't know what year, I can't remember the specific years that are going to bring you to exactly November 9, 2019. In other instances, all she's going to do is demonstrate that November 9 as a date in and of itself is a significant date in history. So I don't think that fully the only way to establish a day is this idea of going from that point in history to this point in history. There's multiple ways you can use time, and that's what I discussed when discussing Tess and how she used time, either with the 273 as a year as a whole, or with 2019 as a year as a whole. Because when she does those years and the different time periods, all those different time periods land on specific days in which those events took place, but it's not necessarily that they take place in that day at the end point, if that makes sense. And even with regards to the story of dictator and the different time periods that she has for those dictators rising and etc., and the impeachments, all those impeachments don't take place on that day. And so when I do this 3 years, 6 months, I'm suggesting it's in a similar fashion, that it's not a story about the day. It's not a study on the day. It's a story about the month and the year, like September to March and March to September. And again, from September here to 2012, I think it was in March again, where you have XYZ taking place, etc. Snyder, then Joy, then Nick, and then we'll probably have to close.
Okay. So I have maybe a clarification to seek. There is a place, I don't remember where, but you had written about, I think, Xerxes and the Sunday law. If you can like clarify what you said, I didn't quite get it. And then there's also a point someone mentioned in relation to voting. And then okay, like Elder Terry has been teaching about how the Sunday law in relation to voting and all those things. And I think you mentioned something like the Sunday law is not entirely an issue to do with voting. Because I think when people speak about voting, they think about November 5th. I think maybe you can clarify what you meant there. And then the last clarification is you defined somewhere about democracy. I don't know how you explained about democracy. I had something like in relation to the separation of powers, the Declaration of Independence, and is voting also subjected into the issue of democracy? Because I think when we look at the RNC, it's also tied into the voting process. So is November 5th. Yeah, so if
Okay.
you can clarify on those three issues, thank you.
Okay. I'll answer them very quickly, and I won't do them justice because I have to go. But the first thing was here, Xerxes and Greece. When we did that study of the last president, the point that we were making in those studies about the last president and the fourth being far richer and etc. is that this was Trump. And the point was that Trump was the last president of the sixth kingdom, that we would mark at this point. So we have Trump, and then we have this transition period. So in history, Xerxes wasn't the last king of Persia. There were various other kings that came after Xerxes. You have I don't know their names. But then in 331, I think, Alexander, Greece is going to go to war, take down the last king of Persia, the literal last king, and he's going to rise up. And that's when Daniel or Uriah Smith is going to point to, this is where the Grecian Empire was established. So my point in saying this was that Trump serves two terms. There's Trump 1 and there's Trump 2. And Trump is fulfilling the role of two different players, as Xerxes in one and as Alexander the Great in another. And they serve two different roles. So all I was pointing out here was that once you get to the seventh kingdom, Greece, this is the only kingdom that's marked as taking over the world. And so my point in saying all of that was that there's this transition period between the sixth and the seventh, where there's all these intermediary kings. I'm going to suggest that this is Biden in his term that separates Xerxes and Alexander the Great, Trump and Trump, and his different hats that he's wearing. And then the second thing, the only point that I wanted to make in this story about voting is that personally, I don't think that the Sunday law is about voting. I think that the Sunday law is more broadly about democracy. Voting forms a component about democracy. That doesn't mean that democracy is voting. So if you have democracy here, voting will be a component of democracy. So will separation of powers, separate, etc., etc., and all the others. That doesn't equal voting. So voting doesn't equal democracy. So I appreciate that at the RNC you have votes taking place and November 9 taking place, but without proving it now, when we think of this as being the issue at the Sunday law, I suggest it introduces unnecessary noise as to what the Sunday law is about. It's about this. This is a component of this, but it doesn't mean that this is this. And then the third thing you asked was, remind me, what was the third thing? And then we'll close for that question with that.
The definition of democracy.
I gave a perspective. I'm not saying it's the definition of prophecy. My point is that in speaking about democracy in a certain way was framing it how Ellen White describes the special properties of the Sixth Kingdom, that it's the principles that are in the Declaration of Independence that make the Sixth Kingdom unique, and then it's the institutions found in the Constitution that protect those principles, and that's what makes the U.S. great, if you want to call it that. And the USA is not actually a democracy. It's a democratic republic, which is different to a democracy. In a democracy, under voting, where power truly resides in the people, you have people saying what they want, and then the majority end up getting the rule of law. In a democratic republic, it means that there are elements of voting, which means there's representation, but there are institutions in place to ensure that the majority don't end up abusing the minority. And that's what you get in the Bill of Rights. It's to make sure that whoever the majority is, they don't end up abusing the people who lost that election, the minority in the government. I hope that answers your question. So I apologize that I'm not able to answer everyone's question. You can ask Elder Emma for my number, and I'll be able to answer your questions there, or we could set up another Q&A at another time. But I'm going to close now, if that's okay. So I'll close with a word of prayer, and yeah. Dear God, thank you for the opportunity to study together. Thank you that we are blessed to be part of a movement that are willing to engage with each other, to explore ideas, to challenge each other, to understand what is truth. I pray that as we continue in our growth together, you may be with us in our studies. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.